Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 271. This week the questions are taken from guides 334 and 335. That's the guide to the Hiyos class carriers of the Japanese Navy and the Orlando class armoured cruisers of the Royal Navy, plus the Wednesday videos on US Navy fleet problems, that being fleet problems 17 through 22, and the video on USS Midway in her museum ship form, and a Friday video on tanks and the Navy. First, before we get into the rest of the questions, a correction. In last week's long dry dock, I answered a question about the comparative value of the 5-inch 38 and the British 4.5, and I made a slight mistake in that I mentioned correctly that their shell weights were approximately the same, but I incorrectly attributed that weight as 25 pounds, when in fact I should have been saying 25 kilos, or about 55 pounds. So hands up, I got that wrong. I was looking back over my spreadsheet for comparison of anti-aircraft weapons, saw 25 as the shot weight for each of them, and my brain immediately filled in pounds, whereas in that spreadsheet I'd converted everything into kilos for ease of the calculation and formulas involved. So my bad on that. Potato Masher asks, had the Japanese Navy's 1920s No.13 Battleship program actually been implemented, how would other Washington Naval Treaty members react? Do you think Japan would see a need for a ship like the Yamatos in the 1930s? And how effective would the No.13s be in World War II? And finally, what do you think a No.13 battleship refit would look like? Well, the No.13s break the Washington Naval Treaty in multiple ways. They're displacing considerably more, and they exceed the numbers of battleships that the Japanese are allowed to have unless the Japanese scrap a bunch of their other capital ships. And, of course, they also exceed the 16-inch gun limit. So, if, for whatever reason, the Japanese had tried to, in secret, construct the No.13s and actually done so despite having signed the Washington Naval Treaty, then the Washington Naval Treaty is basically null and void, and the British and the Americans are going to be left playing catch-up. Now, how that's going to look is probably actually going to be very different, because the British, obviously, they have the N3 design, which, apart from speed, is just flat out better than the No.13s. The No.13s are very heavily armed, don't get me wrong, but they do have a rather critical weakness in that, because the Japanese are essentially trying to invent the fast battleship in the 1920s, when engine technology isn't necessarily quite there when you're really pushing the boat out on the big stuff, which obviously with 18-inch guns and a design speed of 30 knots, a No.13 definitely is. Its belt, albeit with some angling on it, is still only 13 inches thick. Now, yes, I've defended Hood's 12-inch angled belt, but Hood is a mid to late 1910s design, not an early to mid 1920s design, and Hood was designed to fight ships that were, if they're German, mounting 11, 12, 13.4 or 15-inch guns, not 18-inch guns. So, although No.13's armour is quite respectable for 5 years before she's designed, for the time period that she's in and for the opponent she's facing, she is actually quite under-armoured. On about the same weight, the N3 gets an additional 18-inch gun, considerably heavier protection in pretty much all aspects, and essentially sacrifices some speed to do so. Given that the No.13s, if they're sort of magically suddenly revealed, will be at the end of the 1920s, I suspect the British will probably just dust off the N3 plans and then maybe either make them a fraction longer or use a slightly more advanced machinery to get a little bit more speed out of them, but otherwise they'd probably just build the N3s. They'd be happy to trade off the speed for the survivability, I suspect. The Americans are in a slightly different boat because The South Dakotas are slower still. This is the 1920 South Dakota designs, and although they carry the most guns, they are only carrying 16-inch guns, and I suspect that faced with a fast 18-inch armed battleship, or possibly battle cruiser, fast battleship, whatever you want to call the number 13s, I suspect the Americans will probably either go back to the drawing board completely to design a new, faster, more heavily armed battleship to match up, or at the very least they'd go back a step to some of the other heavier design options for the 1920 South Dakota class and try and develop those, depending on how fast they think they need to build their ships. In which case the Japanese probably wouldn't be building the Yamato class in the 1930s, they'd be building something even bigger and more ridiculous, because whilst the Yamato is superior to the number 13 class, it's not superior enough, especially considering that you'd have British and American counterparts built to challenge it, for the Yamato class to have the kind of decisive advantage it was supposed to versus other contemporary ships. So they may kind of skip a level effectively and go straight for something more like A150 with the 20-inch guns. As far as a number 13 refit, assuming they do a full scale refit the way they do to the Congos, you'd see most, if not all, of the casement battery removed and replaced with dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns. The reason I say some, possibly all, is that with the Congo refit, for example, she did have some of those casement guns removed and dual-purpose twin 5-inch put in place, but not all of them. So a variable number per possibly all of them, who knows. Aircraft handling facilities would need to be included, but I think it would depend on exactly when this refit is taking place. If it's taking place in the early to mid-1930s, I suspect the aircraft would be accommodated between the funnel and the mainmast, basically where you can see the boat crane at the moment, because, hey, there's a big powerful crane there already. And if the refit is happening towards the end of the 1930s, then perhaps the aircraft handling facilities would be relocated to the stern and be relatively minimal. The boats would probably be suppressed, and then if it's a late 1930s or even early 1940s refit, then you'd see the entirety of the casement battery suppressed in exchange for lots and lots of tiered anti-aircraft and dual-purpose guns, all in the midship section. The funnel will probably change shape slightly, and of course the for the foremast bridge structure in either a early, mid, or late 1930s refit is going to become even more pagoda-like. Adeline Lowry asks, you've often mentioned that converted carriers were far less efficient than purposefully designed carriers. Considering that the Hiyos were designed to be converted, how efficient were they compared to other carriers? Whilst the ship's hulls, for when it comes to Hiyos and Junyo, did have provision to be turned into aircraft carriers, and they later were, they're still not massively efficient. So if you look at, say, for example, the Saipans, on 10,000 tons less, they're purpose-built like carriers, the Saipans. On 10,000 tons less, they operate almost the same air group, not quite, but slightly fewer, but almost as many. They've got as good or better anti-aircraft armament, and they're considerably faster. And okay, there's a little bit of protection on here, but not really anything that's worth writing home about. And that's on not quite, but almost half the displacement. The Yorktowns are 4,000 to 5,000 tons less than Hiyos and Junyo at standard displacement, and they are faster, better protected, carry more and better anti-aircraft armament, and considerably more aircraft. Then, I mean, probably about the closest you're going to get comparison-wise would be, actually, weirdly enough, British carriers. So if you look at Eagle, which is a converted battleship at least 2 decades older than Hiyos and Junyo, she's still 2,000 tons lighter than Hiyos and Junyo, very slightly slower, operates slightly fewer aircraft, but actually has some armor protection worth writing home about. So, Hiyos and Junyo, arguably for the couple of 1,000 tons additional weight, they're more efficient than Eagle. But considering Eagle was a first-generation conversion out of a battleship, not really a huge amount to write home about. And then the other comparison points you could look at would be Ark Royal. So Ark Royal is still about 2,000 tons lighter than Hiyos and Junyo. She's considerably faster, about 5 knots quicker, considerably more heavily armed, considerably more heavily armoured, and can carry a much larger air group. And then the closest you're going to get to the just over 24,000 ton standard displacement of a Hiyos is probably an Illustrious class. They're 23,000 tons, so 1,000 tons lighter. They're also considerably faster. Obviously have massively more armour. That's the kind of whole thing. Much better protected. And about the only thing that Hiyos can do compared to Illustrious is she can ostensibly carry more aircraft. 36 on paper for Illustrious versus 54 on paper for Hiyos. But of course, during the war, the Illustrious proved capable of actually operating a slightly larger air group than Hiyos when adopting similar deck parking practices, so she doesn't even get that. So essentially speaking, whilst there's a little bit more thought given to building the hulls with conversion in mind, Hiyos and Junyo still are conversions, and that's without going into the details of, the merchant quality hull, etc., etc. Okay, it's beefed up slightly, but not hugely, and all the other issues that the carrier had. So, yes, she is slightly, or they, I suppose, are slightly more efficient than some other similar weight carrier conversions, but it's only a slight improvement over a carrier conversion of a much less well-suited baseline hull that was done 2 decades earlier at the dawn of the carrier age. So, yeah, that's sort of damning with faint praise, really. Michael Kovacic asks, how large was the speed difference of a typical World War II battleship with a full fuel load versus one with almost empty tanks? For example, a Bismarck could store over 7,000 tons of fuel, so I'd expect a bit of a speed difference if she was running on fumes. Unfortunately, there is no such thing as a typical World War II battleship. You've got Italian battleships that are relatively short range, so they don't carry too much fuel relative to their size. You've got British battleships which have a decent range, but not massively long because they're not anticipating fighting across, the entirety of the Pacific. You've got the American and Japanese battleships, which do have quite a long range because they are expecting to fight for a considerable amount of time in the Pacific. And you've got the German battleships like Bismarck, which are anticipating being out on their own for a very long period of time and are carrying unusually large amounts of fuel. So, unless you want to go by sheer tyranny of numbers, which would actually skew things a little bit more towards the high end because you'd be looking at something like the US, there isn't really a typical fuel to displacement ratio across the battleships of World War II. However, with that said, yes, a ship that is running out fully loaded with fuel versus one that's used most of its fuel will be capable of traveling a little bit quicker because, with reduced displacement, it's going to ride slightly higher in the water, which in turn is going to reduce the amount of resistance the water offers to it, which is going to allow the ship to go faster for a certain amount of power. There are, however, a few caveats to that, one of which is, of course, fuel tanks are positioned all along the ship, so if, for example, you are using fuel from your rear fuel tanks first and gradually working your way forward, that's going to affect the trim of your ship differently as compared to if you are going in the reverse order of that, or if you're trying to draw off multiple tanks simultaneously, or you're going from the middle tanks, etc., etc. But you also have to account for the fact that ships' trials, depending on the nation, are usually run under either partial load or under an artificially light load in some cases. And so a ship that is absolutely fully loaded, all men, all supplies, all ammunition, etc., etc., maximum fuel stowage, is probably actually not going to be capable of its stated top speed. So in the case of most of the treaty fast battleships that are supposed to do 27, 28 knots, a rather suspect, based on the records I've looked at, that if you look at, say, a King George V or a South Dakota or North Carolina, trundling out of port completely packed to the gills with weapons, men, and ammunition and fuel, they're probably not reaching that, 26 knots, maybe. Maybe less, even, depending on the sea state. But as they use up those supplies and burn off that fuel, their speed will increase. At some point, they'll pass through the regimen where they can actually do exactly what they say on the tin. And then if you get to the other end of things where you're running very, very light on supplies, effectively you're almost doing a speed trial type experiment, then you might be a knot or two over your notional speed. So it's a little difficult to divorce the use of all the fuel from the use of other supplies like food, etc. But I would suspect that there's, based on at least the records that I've seen, probably anything between a 2 to 4 knot total spread of speed, depending on the ship in question, its total power output, and the proportion of its total displacement is taken up by fuel, etc., etc. Christopher Babylon asks, would it be safe to say that the Orlando class was trying to get too much out of too little a hull? To a certain degree, yes, but also no. The reason why I say to a certain degree is because when you look at later armoured cruisers that were considered somewhat more successful, you tend to be looking at armoured cruisers that are, at least displacement-wise, pushing something in the order of 2/3 the displacement of contemporary battleships, and size-wise, some of them are actually slightly larger in dimensions, not necessarily in displacement because they're not carrying as much weight of armour and guns. But the Orlandos are somewhat on the smaller side for that. When you look at the contemporary battleships that are being laid down around their time, the Admiral-class battleships and the Victoria-class, the Orlandos are not quite, but trending more towards 50% the displacement of a contemporary battleship, which in and of itself indicates that they are proportionally a little bit small. But I think the fundamental problem with the Orlandos, and indeed the fundamental problem with a lot of armoured cruisers in the 1880s generally, is that the armoured cruiser concept, whilst sound in theory for the overall time period, really doesn't work in the 1880s, simply because guns have been getting more numerous and larger and hitting harder, which has necessitated a dramatic increase in belt armour compared to armoured cruisers of the 1870s and even the very, very early 1880s, which is these advances in guns have also started to drive a completely different layout of ship. But the armour technology itself hasn't advanced hugely. They're still using compound armour. Okay, it's better than iron plate, which you would have been using a decade or two earlier, but compound armour, which is still substantially made of iron, requires ridiculous amounts of thickness, which in turn requires ridiculous amounts of displacement to give you anything like adequate protection. And that is the biggest problem, because if you've got these newer, slightly more powerful guns, and as an armoured cruiser you're supposed to be proof against them, at least at cruiser grade firepower, you actually need a very thick belt still, and that just has mass in it. Because the thing you've got to remember is, whilst compound armour mechanically is a far inferior armour to Harvey steel or Krupp steel, it doesn't really weigh any less. We're still talking about iron and steel here. The relative densities are within shouting distances of each other, which means that if you have an armoured cruiser a decade or two down the line that's rocking a 6-inch Krupp steel belt, that's going to have considerably more protective value than the 10 inches on the Orlandos. It's still much, much lighter for that greater protection than the Orlandos is heavier for worse protection. And I think that's the fundamental problem with trying to build a armoured cruiser towards the late game stage of compound armour. You end up making a belt that's so thick and so heavy it just doesn't work efficiency-wise on a ship that's much smaller than a contemporary battleship, at which point you've basically built a small battleship. And if you don't, and you go smaller, you get something like the Orlandos. So, yeah, the hull is a little undersized, but I think it's more the fact she has to use compound armour in the 1880s and still be a cruiser that really does in for the class. Deeks asks, a question on Fleet Problem 17. The actions undertaken sound very much like Japanese tactical doctrine. Is this a coincidence? Was the US Navy looking at Japanese fleet composition and making assertions about how it might be used? Or did the US have a firm idea of Japanese fleet doctrine? As a supplementary question, did the Japanese get any insight into US tactics from observing the fleet problems, or was the US quite good at keeping prying eyes away? For the latter part of the question, it depended very much on exactly which fleet problem you were looking at. A lot of the early fleet problems, and indeed even the sort of the mid and even the early parts of the latter stages of the fleet problem program, were as much, if not more, about PR as they were about training. So if you invite press, observers, and publicize it all in advance, so if they want to, other ships can show up to watch if they can keep up, then it's relatively easy for other people to get at least an idea of what your fleet tactics are. I mean, obviously, a reporter covering it and having to, well, A, submit an article that's got to fit within word limits, and B, obviously probably not understanding exactly what he's seeing, all things considered. And even if he does, he's only seeing it from one ship's perspective. That's not going to give you as clear an idea of what the US Navy's tactics are as compared to, say, reading all the reports later on, which is what obviously the US Navy itself is doing. But it would give you a decent enough idea that you could get a handle on probably what the US is thinking. However, as the fleet problems go on, the US as a whole generally tends to get more and more closed about it. So, the venues change to somewhat more secure ones. Access for press, public, foreign observers, etc. becomes first limited, then almost entirely removed, and they become much more closed shop exercises. So I would say, if the Japanese in the late 1920s want to know what the US is thinking tactically, it's going to be much easier for them to find that out from looking at publicly available records of fleet problems as compared to, say, 1936 or 1937, when the US is playing its cards very close to its chest. The flip side is, of course, that the Japanese did also have their own fleet exercises. They were normally a little bit more concerned about security than the average US Navy fleet problem, considering that the bulk of US Navy fleet problems were PR-related events as well. But again, until the Japanese started playing their own hand very closely, it wasn't too difficult to imagine what Japanese tactics might be. Plus, of course, the Japanese had a long-standing alliance, relatively recently severed, with the British, with the Royal Navy, and therefore there was a certain degree of tactical cross-pollination between the Japanese and Royal Navies that would persist to a certain extent. The Royal Navy also had battle cruisers, and so the US Navy could either just look on or ask the Royal Navy roughly how it planned to use its battle cruisers and combine that information with what they observed the Japanese doing in their fleet exercises, Japanese statements, etc., and come up with a relatively decent, idea of what Japanese tactical doctrine might be. Plus, to be perfectly honest, obviously, a lot of the time they were simulating the Japanese fleet as one side of the fleet problems, and if they were realistically restricting their own forces to US capabilities and giving the Japanese quote-unquote ships their historic capabilities, this is one of the reasons why they used heavy cruisers to simulate battle cruisers as soon as they could. because of the speed issues, there are only so many effective tactics you can use with that kind of force breakdown, and the US Navy captains weren't stupid, so they could come up with things that either consciously or unconsciously would mimic Japanese fleet tactics in those scenarios, even if they didn't have necessarily huge access to the actual Japanese doctrine. Patchouli Knowledge asks, it seems like in some of the footage in the Fleet Problem video, there's a cruiser slicing through the water, constantly hitting big waves, and then gets its bow really heavily splashed with water. How badly does seawater affect the barrels of naval guns, and how easy is it for them to be replaced? Seawater doesn't really affect the outside of gun barrels too badly, assuming that your painting and maintenance has been kept up with, because of course the paint will form a protective barrier against the corrosive effects of salt water, and that'll be several layers of paint and primer and all sorts of things. Now, the interior of the guns, however, that can be quite a lot of negative effects, because of course, for one thing, the interior of the gun barrel has to be raw metal, because any paint's just going to burn off and cause issues when the gun is fired, which in turn means it's much more vulnerable to corrosion. Plus, of course, if you end up with a bunch of water sitting in your guns, not only is that going to corrode the interior, but it's also going to cause some rather interesting issues when it comes to trying to load the guns and opening that breech. So, in order to stop those kinds of effects, gun barrels in non-engaged periods were typically stopped up by things called tompions or tampions, depending on exactly what you're using, exactly what navy you're in, etc. But essentially they're plugs at the end of the barrels to stop water getting in. Now, these can be almost like the tip of a biro pen, so a cylinder that mostly slots into the barrel with a flange to seal it. They can be a kind of cap, and that can either be solid, or it could be canvas, or it could be a combination of the two. And the more lightly built ones could even remain on the guns when they're being brought into action, because the blast of the gun firing will blow them to pieces and or blow them out. With some of the heavier ones, ideally you'd want to get those out of the gun barrels first, because that might cause some issues with your initial salvos, and also being bigger and heavier, they tend to be more expensive and much less easy to replace if you do blow them to smithereens. But anyway, the point of those is to keep the water out of the guns, out of the barrels of the naval guns, in order to prevent water damage resulting. This is also one of the reasons why in exceptionally heavy weather, when you look at some photos of capital ships, cruisers, etc., they might be sailing into the seas, into heavy seas, with their gun turrets turned to face backwards, because of course if you're like USS North Carolina here, bounding through the seas, then your end caps, whatever that you happen to have on your barrels, will be subjected to the pressure and force of water coming green over your bow. They may stand up to it, they may not, they may allow a bit of leakage, they may not, and so when you're really worried about the state of the sea, you just turn your turrets to face as far aft as possible, which reduces all of that kind of thing. John Oz asks, at about 4 minutes 48 in the last Fleet Problems video, the battleship in frame has a large boxy object overhanging the sea at about amidships. What is it? It doesn't look like a gun mounting, but it's too close to an oblong for some sort of boat. Whatever it is would seem to be very susceptible to heavy seas hitting the side of the ship. Well, this is the screen cap at the time. This is either New York or Texas. I can't immediately tell. I know there's some details that will tell me which one it is, but it's one of the two. In any case, I'm assuming, if I'm reading the question right, that what you're talking about is that sort of overhanging shape that's casting a rather large shadow, which from the perspective that we're looking at appears to be just to the left of the funnel. That would seem to match the description in your question. Now, what that is, that the most of the darker grey bit that goes right down towards the waterline is in fact shadow, and what you're looking at is actually a gun mounting, believe it or not, or a gun mounting for several guns. Now, this was not always the case. If you look at older pictures of New York and Texas back when they still have their lattice masts, cage masts, you'll see that they have a whole series of casement-mounted guns running along the sides of the hull, and the hull is, relatively speaking, flush. However, during the refits, which gave them these rather distinctive tripod masts, the secondary battery was rearranged, and part of that, as well as installing the big torpedo blisters which are running down the side of the ship close to the waterline, part of that was building this kind of sponson in which some of the secondary battery was located. And in fact, here's Texas, well, not today, but here's Texas as she was in Drydock towards the beginning of this year. And there is that sponson you can see with the two guns pointing out perpendicular to the ship. Now, you will notice a couple of things immediately. One is that the shadow in the screen cap from the 1930s does make it look like it sticks out an awful lot more. It's just the sun is fairly high in the sky. It's casting a rather unhelpful shadow. But the other thing you'll notice, as you can very clearly see here, it's just on the sort of middle left of our screen, is that this sponson does have a fairly angled chamfered underside, precisely to deal with the kind of thing you're talking about, heavy seas coming up the ship. So that will hopefully deflect a good chunk of water that might be coming up the side of the ship out and away without it, coming straight up into the casements for the secondary guns. So hopefully that supplies a relatively decent answer to your question, because we're very well spotted. Scott Mason asks, I was recently watching Pirates of the Caribbean Dead Men Tell No Tales, and there was a scene at the start of the movie that caught my attention. During that scene, one of the characters who was part of a Royal Navy ship's crew was accused of being a coward, so the officer ripped his jacket as proof of this, and this caught my attention because I'd never heard of this being a thing. So my question is, whether this actually was something they did, or was it something that the movie invented? And what did they do if this wasn't the case? I'm not aware of that particular method of branding somebody as a traitor or a coward to lock them up. But the general idea in military terms in the period of degrading someone to basically what we'd call today a dishonourable discharge, and in the Royal Navy would be termed disrating somebody, would involve ripping all badges and other insignia of rank off of their uniform. Now, obviously, depending on the time period, would depend on, where this is shown on their uniforms. But typically, when the Royal Navy actually had a uniform that showed these kinds of rank displays, you'd have obviously the gold braid on your cuffs, as well as perhaps some kind of epaulet or badge or something on the shoulders or upper portion of your sleeves. And so removing those would, if you were going for the dramatics, rip apart your uniform and could cause rips in the top parts of your sleeves, in roughly speaking the same kind of manner as what you see in Pirates of the Caribbean. Of course, with that particular scene, the character in question isn't even an officer. He's serving under a midshipman. You can quite clearly see on his jacket he has no insignia of rank. So, as far as I am aware, and with that caveat, whilst what they're doing does seem to be generally inspired by actual ways of effectively dishonourably discharging somebody of the period, I'm not aware of that specific thing being a way of marking out somebody, especially of the lower ranks of the crew, the non-commissioned officers, or just general able seamen. I don't think that's how they would have done it. Apart from anything else, there's very few changes of clothes that these men had available. So you rip up one, they're probably going to be in a little bit of dire straits, which you're going to have to make up later on for. But as a kind of informal, showing that you are done with this person and no longer want them as part of the crew. I can see some captains doing it, at least unofficially, although, as I say, that is within my knowledge of that particular field of naval history. If someone who is a specialist in the merits and demerit system of Royal Navy ships in that period, as far as ripping apart bits of their uniform for the non-commissioned part of the crew, feel free to chime in. Sean Quigley asks, is there any chance the Panzer IV that was blown off the quayside is still there under the water? Wonder if that's the case, if any of your viewers might be able to find it. It's possible that it's still there, although locating it would be a bit of a feat, because you've got to contend, I think, with two major factors. Well, maybe even three. The third factor would be establishing where exactly and along precisely which quay in the harbour in question the Panzer IV went over the side on. That's, stage one of proceedings. Stage two would then be to check if that pier or quay or jetty or whatever hadn't been dredged and cleared either by the Germans themselves in the aftermath or in the post-World War II era, because obviously something like that resting in the water might be a bit of a navigation hazard at low tide for ships trying to come up and dock alongside later on. And the other thing you've got to also worry about is that quite a lot of those quays, jetties, piers, etc. basically don't exist in their World War II format anymore. Some of them do, but an awful lot of them have either been removed, relocated, or substantially built up since. So even if it was still there, it may now be entombed under several dozen feet of concrete. So it would be a case of essentially starting back with the original account by the gunner in the Royal Navy and establishing where exactly to look first. Brendan Boersdorf asks, do you think the US Navy's concern over using Ranger in the Pacific was justified? Would it have been able to provide good service at Coral Sea or Guadalcanal despite their misgivings? I think, given the amount of damage that US carriers in the Pacific ended up having to absorb, yeah, their concerns pretty much were validated. I mean, when you look at what happened to, say, USS Wasp, she didn't last too long. Even though the damage that she took, okay, it might have killed one of the bigger carriers, but it also might have survived. So when you look at Wasp and Ranger, in some ways they do look somewhat comparable, but when you look a bit closer, you'll notice that although both of them have essentially zero armor when it comes to resisting air attacks, Wasp does at least have some, Ranger doesn't. Also, the Ranger's protection against impacts on the side, whether that be from shells or missiles from bombs, is even less than that of Wasp. They are about the same speed, they are about the same displacement, but Wasp can operate more aircraft, and Wasp can operate torpedo bombers, which Ranger at that stage in proceedings cannot. Ranger is also somewhat shorter ranged and has a slightly smaller flight deck than Wasp. So essentially in almost every paradigm except for anti-aircraft guns, Ranger is to varying degrees worse than Wasp, and as I said, we know what happened to Wasp, and by early war US Navy standards, that inability to work with torpedo bombers is going to be quite important as well, even though in practice it turned out US Navy dive bombers were perhaps a little bit more useful in countering the Japanese carrier forces. So, I mean, as a flight deck platform, Ranger could have helped putting more aircraft into the skies, but ultimately the kind of bomb hit that would send Enterprise back for its umpteenth visit to the shipyard, or would allow Yorktown to be patched up just about in time to participate in the Battle of Midway, or Saratoga's various visits to the shipyards, etc., etc. All of those hits, which the other US Navy carriers could and did absorb and then spring back from, almost any of them probably would have been the end of Ranger, straight up. And given that all the US Navy fleet problems pre-war suggested that carriers could be found, and if they were found, they were probably going to get hit, and if they did get hit, they were probably going to die, I would say the US Navy probably made the right call in not sending Ranger to the Pacific. There is an outside chance that she would lead an absolutely charmed life and never get hit and come through the war perfectly intact. But given that that didn't happen for any of the US carriers that were in for the whole war, or most of it, even the ones that, finished off with a pretty good track record like Enterprise, I would say that in all likelihood, Ranger probably would have been blown up relatively easily by the Japanese during 1942. Vokir asks, why were so many documents regarding the US Navy's neutrality patrols in World War II destroyed? As far as I can tell, they weren't. I did look through a number of different books, references, papers, couldn't find any reference to wide-scale destruction of neutrality patrol documents. And when I thought, well, maybe there's something on JSTOR or something, so I put it into a web search, the only reference I could find to significant destruction of neutrality patrol documents and a connection to Admiral Bristol, which Fakir mentions in his larger question, appears to be a single unsourced line on Wikipedia. And in fact, that entire paragraph only has a single reference, which is a US Navy Proceedings article from the 60s, which basically doesn't say anything much about almost the entire contents of that paragraph, as is unfortunately somewhat typical of Wikipedia articles. So I then thought, okay, well, what exactly is this paragraph claiming? And it seems to be talking mostly about the support force, aka Task Force 24, and this is some kind of hyper-secret thing that Admiral Bristol destroyed the documents for to protect US neutrality's reputation going forwards. But if you look for documentation about the US Navy's support force and on its neutrality patrols, and Task Force 24 in particular, what its orders were, etc., there's a fair amount of information out there that's available. Everything from, digital copies on NARA and various other US military-related websites that are, direct scans of Task Force 24 documents, summaries, reports, few papers even that have been written in the 90s. So my overall conclusion is that either the documents weren't destroyed, or in the relatively unlikely event they were, they did a pretty darn poor job of it. It would be very, very, very difficult to conceal, because the documentation that does exist, that's within easy access for Task Force 24 and aka the support force, shows that it operated alongside with and trained with the Royal Canadian and Royal Navies at points, and obviously had to coordinate with them in the Atlantic. So the Canadian and British archives will have records of their own. So even if someone had managed to purge all of the American documents, which they haven't, it would still be very obvious that this task force existed just by going to the British archives or the Canadian archives, which the US doesn't have any control over. About the only thing that I can imagine, looking at the publication dates and mentions of the support force - Task Force 24, when you examine, as I say, the readily available stuff, is that it's all either copies of documentation that was around at the time, or it's papers and articles that were written starting in the late 80s. So potentially a lot of those documents might have been classified for an extended period of time and only released towards the end of the Cold War, but they certainly don't seem to have been destroyed unless I've missed something really, really big. SMS Schliessen asks, recently I visited Palma and there are a few probably 5-inch-ish guns and an 8-inch gun displayed at the fort along the beach near the port. Do you have any information as to where they come from and what guns they are? Thanks. According to the museum, most of the artillery they have there is actually from Mixed Artillery Regiment number 91, which was a coastal defence primarily, regiment, if I'm translating the Spanish correctly. And obviously, upon its dissolution, they donated a lot of their existing stuff to the museum. So that includes obviously stuff they were using at the time of the dissolution, but also much older, all the way back to bronze mortars and so forth. Unfortunately, the relatively brief description I got from the museum doesn't go into the specific details of every single gun, but given that the vast majority of the more modern Spanish coastal defense guns are old German weapons, usually from pre-dreadnoughts and things like that, I would suspect that the vast majority of the bigger ones that you saw are probably those. If they've got an 8-inch gun, however, I don't know where that would have come from, because the Canarias-class cruisers would seem to be the most obvious donors, but the other 8-inch guns from those cruisers that are still around are still in their turrets, and that would be sort of the most proximate recent donor of an 8-inch weapon, at least a naval one. Now, of course, you could get a 2 or 3mm artillery weapon, which has only ever been used in coastal or field artillery by the Spanish army, and it could be one of those, but obviously I wouldn't know about that because it's not been deployed to sea at any given point. So on balance, albeit I don't know whether the Spanish coastal or regular artillery ever operated a 2 or 3mm gun, I would personally suspect that if they do have an 8-inch gun there and it's not in a twin turret, it's probably something more like that. It's less likely that they took an 8-inch gun out of a Canarias-class cruiser and just used that as a standalone artillery. But who knows? Maybe I should visit this place at some point. Wienve asks, during the Napoleonic Wars, what did the French Navy think of the design of the captured British ships that they had in service? Obviously, assessments of individual ships varied quite considerably because the construction and quality of individual ships across time and across different sizes varied quite considerably. But, broadly speaking, the French assessed the British ships that they occasionally captured kind of in a bit of an inverse way to the way the British assessed the French. So the British tended to look at the French ships and think, they're bigger, they're a little bit faster on a proportional basis, which they quite liked, but they generally thought that French ships were too lightly constructed for the line of battle quite often. So even when they copied a French design, they would build a ship that was not a direct copy, but inspired by the lines of, but built considerably heavier. The French, on the other hand, would tend to find that the British ships, obviously, assuming that they weren't coppered, tended to sail a little bit slower than their equivalent in the French Navy, but were more heavily built and sturdier for the line of battle. Looking from a very general overview of what the French then did with the British ships that they ended up capturing, I would say that based on the evidence of what the French actually then used the ships for, they seem to have thought that the British ships of the line were perfectly serviceable. When they got one that was in vaguely intact condition, they tended to be quite happy to recommission it into their navy and stick it in the line of battle, which is why you have both the Berwick and Swiftsure at Trafalgar on the French side, plus the Swiftshure's successor, another Swiftsure, on the British side. And Berwick and Swiftsure, the French-flagged ones, are both recaptured. But when it comes to frigates, the French seem to have been a little bit more hesitant to reuse British frigates. Now, they certainly did recommission some captured British frigates into their navy, but it seems to have been on a much less frequent basis proportional to the number they got compared to British ships of the line. Now, granted, that may be partly because a ship of the line is a much bigger, much more expensive investment, so if you in any way, shape or form can, you would want to bring it into your own navy. But I also suspect that since French ships, again assuming that both ships have clean hulls, which obviously the British will maintain longer with their coppering system for most of the Napoleonic Wars, but never mind. But on a purely design basis, the French ships tend to be a little bit faster, and for frigates, speed is considerably more valuable than it necessarily is for ships of the line, where durability also has a huge amount to say. I would suspect that the French probably were less keen to reuse Royal Navy frigates on the basis that the French could build frigates that were somewhat faster. Glenn Ricafrente asks, can you talk about the Montreux Convention, the international agreement governing the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits in Turkey, and its effect on naval affairs in the region? This came about in the interwar period because who exactly should control the Dardanelles, the Bosporus Straits, whatever you want to call them, in terms of ship access and how that should be regulated had been a bit of an ongoing debate for quite a while, starting in the 19th century and going forward in time. However, in the aftermath of World War I, somewhat understandably, the Allies had demanded of the then new Turkey, because previous to that it had been the Ottoman Empire, that there should be a complete disarmament of the Dardanelles Straits, and everybody should be free to go as they like, with the sole caveat that there would be a League of Nations body involved in supervising it all. Of course, in 20th century politics, the one thing that's even less useful than let's get the UN involved was let's get the League involved. And the League of Nations by the 1930s was facing a bit of a problem in that, you know, a bunch of countries were disregarding what it said, and also a lot of the countries that had originally forced Turkey to disarm the Straits were now on kind of opposite sides. So the chances of them coming around and all agreeing on whether or not someone should or shouldn't go through the Straits was fairly slim. And Turkey, not liking this particular scenario, turned around and said, well, hey guys, we kind of want to take back control of our straits. And that led to the Montreux Convention, which was essentially a three-way standoff between Britain and France in one corner, who actually wanted to keep the straits open for the most part, but wanted to essentially forbid military traffic entirely, unless it was theirs, of course. Basically because they wanted to keep the Soviet Black Sea Fleet in the Black Sea. Then you had Turkey, who were kind of, we want to be able to control whoever comes and goes according to our own desires. And you had the Soviets, who obviously wanted their Black Sea Fleet to be able to come and go into the Mediterranean, and so were more in favour of a kind of general open passage as it had been previously. In the end, the compromise was that during peacetime, merchant traffic could come and go as it wanted, and then there was a kind of graduated allowance. So obviously Turkish military vessels could go as they pleased. Foreign vessels that didn't have territory within the Black Sea were extremely limited in terms of individual size and in terms of overall numbers that could be present, which was set by an upper limit on tonnage. And there was, as I said, maximum size and type to the ships that they could send individually. The Black Sea powers, which at the time essentially meant Turkey and Russia, and since Turkey could do what it liked, basically meant the Soviet Union, they could send considerably larger vessels through with shorter notice periods, and there was a whole set of clauses about wartime as well. Essentially, if Turkey wasn't involved in the war, then they could shut the straits to all military traffic, and if they were involved in the war on one side or the other, then obviously they would shut it to some and not others, but they had the right to do that if they wanted. One of the more immediate effects was that it was seen as generally a way of placating Turkey by Britain and France to try and avoid the Turks coming in on the side of the Axis in any potential near-future war, like, say, World War II, the way the Ottoman Empire had come in on the side of Germany in World War I. And you could say that kind of worked, because Turkey didn't enter on the side of the Axis. But most of its later effects are beyond the scope of the Channel, because obviously once you get past World War II, the scope of the Channel runs out pretty quickly. But suffice to say that in the Cold War, exactly who could and couldn't send warships into the Black Sea, and for how long, and how many, etc., etc., it was a thorny point during the Cold War. It's still something of a thorny point today. Yeah, then you get into the modern politics of it, which is, shall we say, fun. Also, interestingly enough, as with a number of other rather important international maritime treaties, the USA is not in fact signed up to the Montreux Convention, which means that technically speaking they could disregard it, but historically they have kind of mostly usually respected it, just by default. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, if a treaty locking warship designs in their current states for 20 years was agreed to in the late 19th century, during which year would its going into effect have had the greatest impact on the course of warship design, assuming that it has similar effects as the Washington and London treaties did, displacement and gun-wise? Consider ship types like capital ships, cruisers, torpedo boats, etc. I think there are two possible years where it would have the greatest impact. So one would be 1890 and the other would be 1895. And there's a very specific reason that I go for that. I mean, 1895, okay, you could also go for 1900, but either way. So if you go for the later date, whether that's 1895 or 1900, what you would essentially be doing is following the principles of the Washington Treaty, where you're locking things in at the upper end of what's currently in service. You'd be, broadly speaking, locking in battleships as limited to, in the future, 12-inch gun caliber and 16,000 tons, because that's approximately the displacement of a Majestic-class battleship. Now, the interesting thing is not so much how that would affect pre-dreadnought design for the next decade or so, because if you look at most pre-dreadnoughts, they're actually slightly less than that for the majority of the pre-dreadnought time period, because obviously they're advancing with things like Krupp steel and so forth. So, you know, the 1895 to, say, 1903, 1904 period probably doesn't see a huge amount of change, but then you get to the point where historically we start to get semi-dreadnoughts like the Dantons and the Lord Nelsons and so on and so forth, and then the dreadnought period. But for true semi-dreadnoughts or full-on dreadnoughts, they all need considerably more displacement. And if you're locked in at 16,000 tons and 12-inch guns, you can probably get a decent-ish semi-dreadnought. You can probably get, if you classify a dreadnought as something just, you know, arbitrarily all big gun and more than 4 of them, you can probably get a form of dreadnought in. At 16,000 tons, you could just about get the South Carolinas, for example, but you're going to struggle to get anything much more than that. So you're going to be looking at ships making a number of compromises, going through to, depending on whether it's 1895, that would run through to 1915, 1900 will run through to 1920. It's probable the system will collapse at some point in the 1910s, because technology would just grow to a point where you could do so much better. But I also suspect for weight and space-saving measures, I think people will be forced into adopting triple and quadruple turrets a lot quicker. Now, if you do it in 1890, when something like HMS Victoria here is the latest and greatest, now that's even more interesting, because with 16.25-inch guns and some of the Italian ships sailing around with even bigger, the actual gun caliber is probably going to be fixed a lot higher at, 16.25-inch or whatever, because this is right before the revolutions in metallurgy and propellant that allow you to have smaller but more powerful guns. But weight displacement is probably going to be capped at 12,000 tons. And at 12,000 tons, you're going to struggle to get even most pre-dreadnoughts built, unless you sacrifice something fairly major like, propulsion. And you're certainly not going to see any dreadnoughts built, but you can have very large guns if you want to. So you might see some very weird and wacky things coming up sort of circa 1905, 1910, as people are trying to fit theoretically extremely large guns, but very small numbers of them, into very small but probably very heavily armoured hulls. And finally, Switch374 asks, a few questions about Japanese midget subs at Pearl Harbor. I understand that 3 were found relatively quickly, 1 on the beach at the east side of Oahu, 2 in the harbour, 1 on each side of Ford Island. When were the two in the harbour found and raised? And since Oklahoma is suspected of possibly being hit by at least one midget submarine torpedo, were either of the subs found in the harbour missing a torpedo when they were discovered, especially the one that was found to the east of opposite Battleship Row? And did the US Navy learn anything useful, or should they have, from the recovered torpedoes? Not quite so. So there were two subs recovered fairly quickly. One of them, Heart 19, is the one that you can see here. This is the one that was on the east side of Oahu and grounded. That was recovered pretty smartish after the attack on Pearl Harbor. You also have number 22, Heart 22. That was sunk by USS Monaghan within Pearl Harbor, and the hulk was recovered fairly quickly, although the remains of that sub were actually used as infill pretty soon after that during the war. That leaves you with Heart 18, Heart 16, and Heart 20. Now, Heart 20 is the one that USS Ward sank. That was only rediscovered in 2002. Heart 18 was discovered in 1960. And then the very last one, which is Heart 16, that is the one that causes the most controversy, because that was discovered in bits in a debris field from the explosion that wrecked a whole series of amphibious ships that were being kept in the West Lock area. And it seems likely that actually the submarine ended up in the West Lock area before sinking or being scuttled, and the wreck was then caught up with the subsequent explosions, 3 years later, and dumped out in the deep ocean. As far as Oklahoma potentially being hit by one or more torpedoes from a Japanese midget sub, well, it can't have been Heart 19, because that never entered Pearl Harbor. Heart 18 was recovered with both of her torpedoes intact, so it wasn't her either. Then Heart 20 was, of course, sunk by Ward outside of Pearl Harbor, so it wasn't her. And Heart 22, the one sunk by Monaghan, she did fire her torpedoes, but it's known that she fired them, at Monaghan and nearby ships, so we can account for them. So it's that last one that was found in the debris field, Heart 16, because it was found without its torpedoes, indicating that it did fire torpedoes before it was lost. And there appears to be a degree of evidence that it did make it to Battleship Row and fire its torpedoes. Exactly what it hit, where they hit, how many of them hit, etc., etc., that's all up for discussion. And indeed, in fact, hopefully in next year I'll be talking to one of the historians who has done a lot more in-depth research on Heart 16 and what she may have been doing during the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. But in relation to your question, it means that 2 were found fairly quickly, not 3, and there has never been a submarine found on the Battleship Row side of Pearl Harbor, even though Heart 16 may well have been there at some point, as in transited through the area, not sunk there. Aside from the existence of Japanese submarines in midget form being very much confirmed, the US Navy didn't learn a vast amount about Japanese technology from them. Apart from anything, there wasn't a huge amount to learn from the torpedoes, because the torpedoes weren't the 24-inch long lances, they were 450mm or 17.7-inch, very much reduced versions designed to fit on these very small craft. And although I suppose if they had done an extremely careful forensic examination of the torpedoes, they might have been able to work out that the fuel systems, or not the fuel, but the air-oxygen supply systems of the torpedoes were somewhat different from US standard. You could argue that maybe they could have then interpolated that into more accurate data about their guesses as to the capabilities of standard Japanese torpedoes, but at the same time, these being very clearly miniaturized midget sub-torpedoes, they could equally have made the conclusion that perhaps this was some kind of special technology made to increase the effectiveness of a very small torpedo, and this doesn't necessarily have to correlate with the capabilities of larger torpedoes, for which again, they could have argued that a more simple and more easily mass-produced drive system would have been used. And that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching or listening, everybody, to this particular episode of the Drydock. And, well, by the time this goes up, the inaugural DRAC takes a group, or actually 2 groups, around Portsmouth Historic Dockyard Tour will have been concluded, albeit at the time that I'm recording this, just before the weekend. Let's just say the weather forecast isn't looking particularly fantastic, but let's hope it all went well. And, well, I have learned a few lessons just from trying to organise this in the first place, and I will put those lessons into place for the future. Nonetheless, future tours in groups of HMS Belfast, possibly Chatham, but probably Belfast and or Portsmouth, to be forthcoming later on. So thanks for listening, everyone, and see you again in another video.